Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Loadshedding, Shebeen Killings, and Fighting Terrorism in Africa episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This month, we look at Eskom implementing Stage 6 load shedding, amendments to Regulation 28, and Shebeen Killings in the Eastern Cape and Gauteng provinces. And in the Africa regional update, we look at the 61st ECOWAS Summit, the DRC declaring the end of the Ebola outbreak, and SADC Mission in Mozambique and the Cabo Delgado recovery plan. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Eskom Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
Yes, hi, Sia. I'm well, very well, thank you, man. It's been the past couple of months have been quite busy, but yeah, we're managing. How are things your side?
I'm very well, thank you. Likewise, I must admit things have been very busy on my side as well for the past 3 months. But I think these are the signs of the times. There's a lot happening and we have a bumper episode ahead of us.
Yep, yeah.
On that note, a reminder to all our listeners on whatever platform you are listening through, hit the subscribe button to keep up to date on all future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share amongst your family and friends. On that note, let's get started with the SA update in brief. The Minister of Health repealed the COVID-19 regulations on the 23rd of June. President Ramaphosa attended the 14th BRICS Summit, and the Salvoko Precinct Development Project was launched on the 26th of June. President Ramaphosa attended the G7 Leaders Summit on the 27th of June. And ICASA invited pre-registration for community radio and television stations on the 30th of June. And the Presidential BBBE Advisory Council meeting was held on the 4th of July. And the Minister of Finance allocated R1 billion for the KZN natural disaster on the 7th of June. And meanwhile, the ABC Motsepe South Africa School Choirs Eisteddfod was held on the 25th of June until the 1st of July. And the draft legal sector code was published for comment on the 7th of July. And government is planning to host the Black Industrialists and Black Exporters Conference on the 20th of July. And the extraordinary summit, the SADC Organ Troika, is planned in Pretoria for the 21st of July. And our first story in the SA update this month is Eskom implements Stage 6 load shedding. Eskom implemented Stage 6 load shedding due to the unlawful and unprotected labor strikes, which caused widespread disruption at various power plants. So 7 of the 10 generation units that had tripped on the 28th of June left 3.2 gigawatts of energy on unplanned maintenance, and 17.6 gigawatts of capacity remained out of service due to breakdowns. On the 5th of July, Eskom reached an agreement on a 7% wage increase for all employees covered in the Central Bargaining Forum, and the National Union of Mine Workers and the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, as well as Solidarity, urged the employees to return to work immediately. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, there have been many excuses over the years put forward. From saboteurs to wet coal to conveyor belts breaking down to the quality of feedstock to pylons being cut, a lot of excuses. There's some truth in part, but this excuse about workers is a bit silly. It's they are being scapegoated in my view, because the strike ended about a fortnight ago, but still we are experiencing blackouts. Even today we had blackouts. The main problem to me seems to be a horribly managed maintenance program that has resulted in the 17.6 gigawatts and plant being out of service due to breakdowns. I mean, and there's also the intermittent renewables that we have. We have wind and solar. They've not been helpful because only 10% of that installed capacity came to our rescue. So it was meaningless. In fact, it was just disappointing. So it means that our main problem as a country is that we don't have enough capacity, and for industrial energy, we need to have base load, not this intermittent power. So you're already talking about coal, and you're still talking about gas, and you're talking about nuclear generation. Basically, what it means is that this transition phase is not going to be easy. There'll still be niggles, there'll still be this and that. Then the other challenge, which I think there is that this all is political, and you also have funding challenges because the big banks and other financial institutions will not be financing coal generation. So you've got that, and you also have environmental commitments by all these institutional lenders. And there are things like gas fracking, which has also which has been mentioned. But we've got, the country has commitments, and we need to stick by them. The ruling ANC has also proposed that a competitor to Eskom be established, and this competitor will be state-owned once again, but then there will be competition. We won't rely on just the one utility for our energy needs. So I think the reason why there is this suggestion, which is not, it is not government, it's not a government announcement as yet, but it's a suggestion mainly, which has come about mainly due to the fact that Eskom is highly indebted, and so they can't finance. So it's a funding problem for Eskom because they can't finance from their own balance sheet. So and the government has been bailing out Eskom for a number of years. So I don't know. Everything is just still up in the air because there are things like, if there is this new entity that they're talking about, which is a long-term solution, it won't help us with our immediate challenges. So we still will be left with who will finance this new entity. Where will the money come from? Will it be blended finance once again? Will it be coal? Will it be nuclear? Nuclear takes 10 years to build. So I don't know, man. It's just there is no leadership coming through at the moment. There's nothing that is concrete. We're just in limbo as a country.
Definitely agree with you. And, this week I actually met one of the ministers of energy in one of the West African countries, and he made a comment which was so poignant. He said, energy investment is so important that it's like riding a bicycle. If you're not investing in energy the same way, if you're not pedaling a bicycle, you cannot move. And for me, I think those words are so true.
Yeah.
But in South African case, it might feel very difficult to understand or to even come up with a plan of how do we attack this, because there's so many moving parts. On the one hand is the issue of investment in generation. On the other hand, it's about maintenance. On the other hand, it's also about the distribution network, which is also under attack from criminals who are stealing some of the infrastructure and selling it. And so for me, it seems we need to have a multi-pronged approach. And I think if we just solely focus on the issue of generation or the problems that exist at Eskom, we might be missing other gaps elsewhere. And I definitely think that we need to take a different stance when it comes to the culture and the rhetoric that we have and our view towards energy, because it is a national asset. we cannot develop the economy and we cannot improve people's livelihoods whilst we have these significant energy crisis challenges that we currently face. My bigger worry and concern is that whilst we're focusing the problem purely on the challenges faced at Eskom as the utility, and finding private sector solutions which may be more efficient or cheaper or more effective and speedy responses, that is definitely not the solution for South Africa, primarily because we have a majority of the population that is poor, that cannot afford to invest in private sector solutions such as off-grid solutions. And so we definitely need to deal with the issue at a national or a public level in terms of the utilities' ability to deliver, whilst at the same time we do need some kind of private sector solution that can create some innovation that will be used in both the public and the private sector. I definitely disagree with some of the general public utterances that I'm seeing in the frustration that some South Africans have in the push to just say, let's just privatize Eskom or let's come up with a private solution, mainly because majority of the population just couldn't afford a private solution to this problem. And so for me, I do think that we need to have a multi-pronged approach in how we deal with this. And we need to understand that, energy security and energy infrastructure is a national asset. And we need to treat it as such. We need to stop criminals who are disparaging the country by stealing the infrastructure. We need to also ensure that the public utility is operating at its efficient and optimal levels. I just don't think that taking an either-or approach in resolving this problem is the right solution for the country.
Yeah, I agree fully.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update, Amendment to Regulation 28. The National Treasury of South Africa gazetted final amendments to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act to promote infrastructure investment by retirement funds. Regulation 28 limits the extent to which funds may invest in a particular asset or asset classes and prevents excessive concentration risk to protect retirement fund members' savings. The amendment will come into effect in 2023 and include a definition of infrastructure, a limit of 45% for infrastructure investment, an increase in the limit for private equity assets of 15%, a limit of 25% for exposure to any one company for all asset classes, and a reduction in the asset allocation to housing loans for retirement fund members from 95% to 65%.
Well, see, I have a question. Will there be appetite to invest locally? I mean, to boost the country's gross fixed capital formation in the long run, because that is what this amendment was supposed to achieve. One can see that there has been a lot of horse trading, that the financial sector lobbied intensely. My gut feeling is that private retirement funds got the deal they hoped for. I mean, this will end up being a directed but not a compelled situation. The biggest win for fund managers is that the changes allow them to allocate a maximum of 45% to offshore equity and the balance of 30% to local equity. There has been a trend over the past 5 years for private mandates to include up to 30% of their fund in 4 offshore markets. This is very serious and self-defeating in my view, because theoretically investments stop being local equity funds once they go over this 30% mark. This means that they will be financing growth in foreign companies at our expense. They will be drying up private capital in the local market. And so the law for offshore equities had, in my view, to do with the past decade of extremely low interest rates in Western markets, which resulted in a glut of cheap money that made its way into the equities market. This has now come to a screeching halt. There is simply more risk than a windfall for our South African fund managers. Proponents, however, claim that in the long term, that the long-term impact of allowing South African residents to grow their retirement pot with more investment opportunities will put more money into the consumer's hands, that it will increase spending on goods and services. But I think this is still short-sighted. Because one has to look at the overall growth of the economy. It not just concentrate on consumption, but shifting investment towards productive assets. A positive is that in our highly concentrated business environment, these amendments could see some divergence with the introduction of a limit of 25% for exposure to any one company for all asset classes, mitigating against risk. It will be mitigating against risk too, because what it will mean is that more companies will get a share of the investment funds. Basically, the amendments for me just simply define what infrastructure is and clearly defined these asset classes. But will we move towards a sustainable 30% gross fixed capital formation to GDP investment culture as envisaged by the NDP 2030? Will these private retirement funds help finance in the long run productive assets? I have my doubts.
I definitely agree with you on that one, Sbu. And I think for me, it would be interesting to see what our actuaries can come up with in terms of a risk-weighted floor rather than just a limit. Because for me, to deal with the issue of appetite, you need to set a floor, meaning a limit that we do not drop below in order to support that target of 30% gross fixed capital formation. I think without setting a floor, meaning a limit that we do not go below, we're never going to reach this 30%. Just purely allowing people to make their own choice and setting an upper limit, because that deals with the challenge of concentration when there's too much demand, but it doesn't deal with the appetite issue, which requires us to set a lower limit such that we have a threshold or a target that we need to build on and never drop below.
Yes.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in the SA update: Shebeen Killings in the Eastern Cape and Gauteng province. On 26 June, 21 teenagers aged between 13 and 17 were killed at Enyobeni Shebeen in Scenery Park, East London, and the South African Police Service is still investigating the cause of death. Meanwhile, the owner of Enyobeni Shebeen and 2 employees were arrested and charged for contravening the Liquor Act. And on 10 July, 23 patrons were shot, 14 killed and 9 injured at a Shebeen in Nomzamo informal settlement, Orlando East, when a group of armed men entered and started shooting randomly.
Well, these to me are all signs that South Africa is in the same boat as middle-income countries, especially former colonies, which are experiencing the middle-income trap. I mean, societal ills, which include high rates of illiteracy, school dropout rates, high school dropout rates, extreme levels of inequality, alcohol abuse, violent crime, just a general state of lawlessness are prevalent in countries that find themselves in this state. One can make comparisons with countries like Brazil, Mexico, India, Kenya, Colombia, etc. The only ones which manage to escape high levels of criminality are the more religious countries or authoritarian countries like China or Pakistan. What has made our case even worse is that there are budget cuts, especially to the Department of Justice, Education, Social, and law enforcement departments. At first, I put the blame on liquor boards who do not ensure that license holders comply with the rules. But they also claim insufficient resources to hire inspectors. And after the shootings in Soweto and then Pietermaritzburg, and recently 6 people were shot and died in different locations in Alexandra, Johannesburg, it became clearer to me that the problem is more widespread, and it's not just a culture of drunkenness and debauchery and that. I mean, even the police minister was jubilant when he mentioned. Okay, he was pleased. Not so jubilant, but he's a jolly fellow. He was pleased when he mentioned that 10,000 recruits for the next year, for 2022 and 2020, and the following year, will enter the service, because there has been no training of new policemen, no intake for the past couple of years, and South Africa has a shortage of policemen. So the country, in fact, has 18,000 less policemen than it did in 2010, than it did like in 12 years ago. So then, and then, yeah. Anyway, it's a complete complex problem. I think it's got to do with budget. It's got to do with a history of apartheid and inequality. It's got to do mainly, in my view, on the middle income trap that we are in.
Sure.
Yeah, poverty is one of the main contributors.
Yeah. Look, I hear your point and I agree with you. And for me, it's just so concerning that given the fact that South Africa is also a highly unequal country, things are actually much worse, in addition to the middle income trap. Because what I'm seeing is that you either form part of the majority who depend on public services, which are also just subpar and cannot be actually provided for majority of the population, or you are part of the few who have enough money, but typically then what happens is all the public services have to be privately provided, whether that be energy in the terms of off-grid solution, security in terms of people living in estates, etc. And you end up paying exorbitant fees through levies in order to sustain these public services, which cannot be provided to the vast majority. I think it's largely also an issue of inequality. In my view, if we had a much less problem of inequality, we would have obviously more contributors to the fiscal coffers, meaning government would also have more money to provide public services and the quality of public services would be better. But at the same time, if you have less of an inequality problem, you have less of a majority who depend on these public services as well. And so it's quite difficult to see how the country is actually going to maneuver its way out of this. And I just don't know whether, is this something that requires some level of social engineering in order to reduce the inequality? And I think the rest of the pieces will fall into place, or whether or not we should just be focusing on private sector growth and, economic growth in order to deal with this. But I don't think that the private sector approach on its own, because it also tends to encourage more inequality, is the solution here. But for me, I think what is slap bang at the middle and the salient point of our challenge, in addition obviously to the middle income trap that you've highlighted, is this fact about our inequality. There are far too few people who have the incomes that are taxed in order to create the public resources to provide public services. And there's a vast majority that still rely on these public resources, which cannot be provided at a good quality or efficiently, given these inequality problems that we face. And I just don't know what really is the right direction. But it is a bit of a complex problem. And I think for me, the central issue is around this inequality. And I don't know how government can encourage ways to reduce this inequality, and obviously this doesn't just fall on the lap of government. I think the private sector itself, just through the lens of sustainability, needs to understand the problem it faces rather than squarely focusing on the narrow issue of profits, because profits are actually just a central point to a bigger problem, which is a problem of sustainability. And I think once we've got the private and the public sector squaring in on the sustainability challenge of reducing inequality, then we'll be able to start dealing with the problems. And I think whilst everyone is either focused on just to get votes, providing social services and social welfare to secure votes, and the private sector focusing purely just on profits, the two won't speak to each other, and the problem of sustainability will never be resolved.
Precisely.
On that note, that brings an end to the SA update for this episode. And another reminder to our listeners, on whatever platform you're listening through, please hit the like button. And if you're enjoying this episode, share it amongst your family and friends. And that takes us to the Africa Regional Update for this episode. On the Africa Regional Update in brief, the Togolese Minister of Economy and Finance was appointed as the governor of the Central Bank of West African States. Ghana prepares for the first possible Marburg virus outbreak on the 8th of July. Meanwhile, the DRC deposited instruments of ratification with the East African Community Secretary General on the 11th of July. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the Africa Regional Update for this episode. The ECOWAS 61st Ordinary Summit. The 61st Ordinary Session of the Authority of Heads of State and Government of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, was held on 3 July in Accra, Ghana, to discuss security situation in the region, the eco currency, and regional integration. Summit noted the transition plan to hold elections and restore civilian rule by March 2024 in Mali, and decided to lift sanctions except for those against individuals and the suspension from ECOWAS decision-making bodies. Summit also welcomed the release of President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore and noted the revised timetable to hold elections and restore civilian rule by July 2022 in Burkina Faso. Summit reiterated its rejection of the 36-month transition plan in Guinea, appointed former Beninese President Yaya Boni as the mediator to negotiate an acceptable plan before August, and upheld the suspension from decision-making bodies. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, the developments in the West African region offer hope that security fears could be allayed, or let me rather say pushed to the more isolated parts of that region, because Ghana did raise concern that insurgency was beginning to spread to coastal regions, not only parts of the Sahel. So the transitional roadmaps look promising, in my view, because efforts to secure timetables for restoring civilian rule, both in Mali and Burkina Faso, are bearing fruits. Now, it is only Guinea that has stuck to a 36-month transition, which is too long. It was rejected by opposition parties. And so Guinea also refused to accept an ECOWAS mediator. So I think a tightening of the noose could see them relent and opting for a 24-month transition period, as was agreed with both Mali and Burkina Faso. I was skeptical at first, but the steep sanctions, which cut off errant states from land and air borders, seem to have worked. I mean, sanctions crippled Mali's economy and raised humanitarian concerns because arid countries rely heavily on agricultural imports. So this landlocked country needed and other landlocked countries in the Sahel region need open borders so that they can export their commodities and then import consumer goods. So due to those sanctions, Mali ended up defaulting on more than $300 million of its debt, and it was cut off from the regional financial market and the regional central bank. So that knocked some sense into them. So yeah, I think the sanctions are working. I was skeptical at first, and those sanctions have also worked with Burkina Faso because they also proposed a 24-month transition, which was accepted, and the sanctions were lifted. And I should also mention, as the last point, that the drought in the Sahel region also had a contribution because the Malians couldn't import uh, the foodstuffs that they need, and so this causes a humanitarian crisis and threatens that government, and so that also had an effect. I mean, the drought in the region too. So yeah, it seems like ECOWAS sanctions do work.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think the point you made actually was a very, very, very poignant point, around the issue of landlocked countries. And I think what hasn't been well studied and understood in the case of ECOWAS is how effective these sanctions have been for the landlocked countries. But in the case of Guinea, quite clearly, they're not as effective given that the country has access to the ocean and cannot necessarily just be easily choked in terms of, or coerced rather, through these sanctions which block
Yes,
trade routes and its ability to import. So I think you make a
yes, yes.
very, very important point, and I think I'm worried with the case of Guinea, given that despite the threats that the ECOWAS summit has made against Guinea, for example, we covered the story earlier on in April when they had set a deadline to say by the end of April they need to come up with an acceptable transition plan. That deadline passed and they haven't really implemented effective sanctions. Seemingly again with this deadline in August 2022, I would love to see what happens when, or if rather, the transitional authorities don't come up with an acceptable plan. And I do think that the fact that now we've got a coastal country that has access to, the ocean and ability to, in a way, bypass some of the sanctions, I worry that the regional
Uh,
response in terms of the unconstitutional rule or transition of power, it may not be effective. And I wonder whether ECOWAS states are willing to intervene militarily in order to restore civilian rule in the case of Guinea. But I definitely think in the case of the landlocked countries, the sanctions and the regional approach has been very effective and has actually been helpful in restoring civilian rule.
yeah, and yeah, one of these days we should interrogate the illegal drug trade in Guinea. That has been that's what finances these guys, both the elites and the military guys, the illegal drug trade, cocaine. Yeah. Anyway,
Interesting. I think that's a story for another day. On that note, that takes us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update. DRC declares the end of the Ebola outbreak. The Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, has declared the end of its Ebola outbreak after less than 3 months. The most recent outbreak resulted in 4 confirmed cases and 5 deaths, compared to the 130 confirmed cases and 55 deaths in the previous outbreak, which lasted from June to November 2020. The DRC has now recorded 14 Ebola outbreaks since 1976, and 6 of these have occurred since 2018.
yeah, the DRC and Africa at large would do well to embark on active surveillance, just as a general rule, to try so sort of like put an end to these periodic outbreaks of communicable infectious diseases like Ebola. Maybe we could even try get some assistance from Cuba, which is renowned for its preventative model of healthcare. Um, they could offer some assistance, I think, in sort of like a partnership that could be established to train our public health workers in their preventative system. It would require that public health staff um, engage actively in the system and take action in order to receive reports of disease cases. And this may involve calling or visiting health facilities to encourage follow-up, or having staff review medical records to identify cases meeting prescribed case definitions. A community-based surveillance system could also be used to monitor mild disease outbreaks outside of health facilities, because we don't have enough health facilities on the continent. We could also use existing public facilities such as schools or even people's homes, households, um, or even try engaging traditional medicine practitioners. So maybe train them to assist where medical facilities are scarce. Basically, we should aim to use the most effective systems to complement our resource scarcity.
Definitely agree with you on that one. And I think the community-based surveillance system approach for me would be the most effective, because it is what's closer to the people, and I think it'll be able to bridge some of the gaps we have from a resource point of view. Definitely agree with you on that.
Yes, yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update, the SAMIM implementation and Cabo Delgado recovery plan. The extraordinary summit of the Southern African Development Community SADC Troika plus chairperson of SADC met virtually to discuss the SADC mission in Mozambique, SAMIM. Summit approved an interim extension of the SAMIM mandate to facilitate continuation of operations. And the SAMIM has begun implementing the peace-building support initiatives in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, and the program is currently funded by the European Union under the Early Response Mechanism of the African Union Commission. Meanwhile, the government of Mozambique is implementing its Cabo Delgado Recovery Plan, the PRCD, focusing on humanitarian assistance, infrastructure recovery, and the economic and financial recovery. The government still requires an additional $200 million of the estimated budget of $300 million for the PRCD.
Well, the most positive part is the initiative to involve civilians to undertake confidence building measures or programs aimed at addressing mistrust within the communities, to create social cohesion, to facilitate synergies that will foster peace and security and sustain social economic development. I think this is the foundation that they should be building on. This is very commendable. There has to be peace and trust among the communities and within the communities. Also to be applauded is the capacity building of the police and correctional services and skills development programs for the youth and women, for their social development. I just don't think that on their own, these solutions will pacify the security situation in Cabo Delgado. The main reason for the insurgency in the first place was lack of development in the province and grievances concerning a lack of opportunities for advancement, personal advancement, that is. This last part is where my apprehension comes in. The last part about the early response mechanism. In that, it is said that $200 million US dollars. There was a $200 million US dollar shortfall in funding, which I assume would cement a more sustainable long-term solution. My view is that it is commercial enterprise. I mean, it is business and livelihoods, the creation of livelihoods through jobs and opportunities. That is what will pacify the security situation. Youths would not be enticed into joining any insurrection or any grouping if there was economic life or some kind of vibrancy and hope in that region. The promotion of human rights and things like gender equality, democracy, good governance, and things like children's rights, those are all welcome. But putting bread on the table is, for me, what is paramount. So this leads me to my next point, which is my criticism of the early response mechanism of the African Union, which is supported and it is funded by the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus. Um, it is part that this EF SD Plus is part of the EU's investment framework for external action. And this model, unfortunately, relies on investment blending. It relies on guarantees and other financial operations. So they talk about budget support through direct financial transfers into the recipient country's national treasury. Now, I don't know how reliable the Mozambique central government is, because there was that big scandal, that fiscal scandal, where the previous finance minister squandered billions from one of those, I think it was the World Bank, those funds which were meant for development. So my contention is that the reason why only a third, which is just only $100 million, why only that much was secured, is because private sector finance, which is that finance planning scheme, has not come in. I mean, using public funds, which are in Mozambique's case non-existent, to start up or to cover part of the costs of a project is not a viable part of this scheme, because they depend on an economy that is on its knees to kickstart a project, and then only then does private investment come flowing in. And I mean, there are many loopholes there. I think the solution would be to have a structure set up, some sort of a structure which is not part of the national treasury, but a structure that through which funds can be funneled. And we should not be relying on leveraging private investment for these cases such as this one.
Look, it's a bit of a complex one, and I agree with you. I think unless we take a bit of a long-term view rather than just simply dealing with the current insurgency and the rise in violence into Cabo Delgado, and actually have an adequate development plan for Cabo Delgado, we're not going to resolve this, and it might just be a recurring crisis that keeps coming up. The sad part is that, these disruptions and the insurgents actually disrupts adequate private sector investment, which could actually change the situation from a development and an economic opportunities point of view. So yeah, it's just a difficult one. I think what again, and it seems like we just I'm a broken record repeating myself. Private sector needs to get involved. The problem in Cabo Delgado is not whether or not the insurgents can be contained in order for the gas projects to come online and to feed the profit machinery that's invested in to the tune of $50 billion. What's actually needed is an adequate development plan in order to ensure that the locals and the local communities also benefit from the economic opportunities that are presented by the natural gas investments. And I'm very, very saddened by how this insurgence has disrupted what would have been a sort of turning point for Mozambique, given that the country's really been struggling since the hidden debt scandal, was unearthed in 2016, and the gas investments were expected to really start turning things around from 2023 onwards. And I hope that it's just a dream deferred rather than a dream cancelled.
Yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update for this episode. And that takes us to the numbers game.
Yeah, oh, numbers.
Yep. And I think I have another tight one this episode, Sbu, and I want to see if you're going to be able to crack it. So the number for this episode is minus 4.3% year on year in May 2022.
Yeah. I looked at the number and I thought manufacturing has decreased by 4.3% for May. That's just the first thing that came to mind.
Okay, nice guess. Good guess. Close, but no cigar.
Okay.
So actually, it's about electricity generation. So electricity generation decreased by 4.3% year on year in May 2022. And seasonally adjusted electricity generation decreased by 0.6% on a month-to-month basis. Meanwhile, electricity generation decreased by 0.2% on a quarter-to-quarter basis. And this compares quite favorably with a 1.2% decrease on a month-to-month basis during April, and actually is negative when compared to April, where there was a 0.6% increase on a quarter-to-quarter basis. Meanwhile, electricity consumption has also decreased by 2.5% year-on-year in May 2022 and decreased by 0.5% on a month-to-month basis. And there you have it, 4.3% decrease in electricity generation during the month of May.
And remember that antidote about cycling, riding a bicycle. If only going by these numbers, you can clearly see that it will be very difficult to go up to get economic growth of about 1.8% for this year. Just judging by these numbers, because without power, without energy, you are. And on top of this, you have to factor in the fact that you have to factor in fuel costs, which have gone up by 40%. Yeah, depressing stuff.
For me, I'm actually even more worried, because not only did the generation go down, but actually our consumption went down. But in fact, if you look at the situation from a load shedding point of view, things have gotten even worse. In June, you already know that in June, due to the strike, which we mentioned in the first story, that we had a significant crisis when it comes to the generation. And so, things are getting bad, and we really need to sort out the energy crisis in South Africa for the economy to recover. And I don't think that there'll be any economic recovery without resolving the energy problem.
Yeah, we agreed.
On that note, that brings an end to the episode for this month.